Hey, good morning and good day. This is Scott Bain, one of the Vicon team members here at Tridium. We'd like to thank you for attending today's Tridium Talk. This topic was developed to address an increase in questions that we've been receiving from you, such as, can you send me an ATO? And by the way, what's an ATO? And how much should I add to my quote to address the extra documentation required in this DoD spec? We're very fortunate today to have Jay Kurowsky, CEO of Aleta Technologies, and our own David Winiarski, both qualified experts concerning the risk management framework, which is the subject of today's presentation. Jay will also be backed up by others with Aleta Technologies. As I understand, your mics will be muted till the end. However, you may use the Q&A feature to post questions, which will be answered by the panelists as the presentation progresses. And by the way, this Tridium Talk and Q&A will be recorded for prosperity and your future reference. And without further ado, take it away, Jay.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you everybody for attending today. So we are going to be talking about a variety of things here. I'm going to give you an overview of the risk management framework. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Unified Facilities Criteria 40106 and the accompanying Unified Facilities Guide Spec 250511. I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples of government RFPs that have RMF requirements, talk a little bit about what the cyber responsibilities are that need to be executed, and talk a little bit about the cost and schedule impacts. So I've been doing this quite a while, well over 2 decades. I've helped over 1,000 systems through the RMF and prior processes, served a variety of roles on behalf of the Department of Defense and advising the Pentagon and performing other related functions. So while you ask your questions, we've got a Q&A team working silently in the back. And the team includes Doc Elliott, Herndon Elliott, we call him Doc, and Todd Heflin. So Doc has been doing this a long time as well, has similar experience to me with a prior Army career, serving as a Chief Information Officer and a third-party assessor. So under the risk management framework, we call that third-party assessor role a SCUFGS, Security Assessor Validator. So he knows what the government does and how they look for what they look for as part of the assessment process for the risk management framework. And his experience as a CIO also allows him to understand the processes and all the interworkings of getting these control systems connected to the DoD's networks that provide any connectivity required for those networks. So the control systems typically connect to the post networks on DoD facilities. So he's got that experience as well. Todd has experience serving as a SCAV representative, a team leader supporting the third-party assessor. Lots of experience in penetration testing and hardening and all these sorts of things. These guys are supporting projects all around the country and in several other countries and DoD bases in several other countries. So I doubt you'll find a team that's as experienced as these guys. So you're in good hands as they answer your questions. So again, feel free to ask them with the chat function and they will try to address them in real time as I continue the presentation here. So we're just starting in many cases to hear about cybersecurity for control systems, cybersecurity requirements on the DoD and broader federal government. But the truth is the requirements have existed for years and years. Nothing really new there, just the amount of attention being paid to these requirements. The part that is new, though, is what's causing this recent focus on cybersecurity for control systems within the federal government and especially in the Department of Defense. So just a few weeks ago, we had a presidential executive order signed by President Trump titled Securing the United States Bulk Power System. So obviously lots of control systems form the bulk power system. So that one is focused on bulk power, but there are also many different things that that have been happening lately. DoD memorandums, including at least one signed by the Secretary of Defense himself, execution orders signed by Secretary of Defense and others, Inspector General audit reports, so IG audits, what we call IG audits. So all these things are creating far more focus on these requirements that have existed, as well as many attacks you've been reading about in both in the public and private sector. So this thing called risk management framework is the basis for most of the cyber requirements. So on this slide, I'm kind of walking you through how the RMF, both the federal RMF and the DoD RMF, flows from public law. So the legal basis is Public Law 107-347 back from 2002, which is the E-Government Act. From there, we've got something called Federal Information Security Management Act. You may have heard of something called FISMA. And then that flows into NIST requirements. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, as you see in that little legend on the bottom there. And lots of different NIST special publications. The one specifically titled Risk Management Framework is NIST Special Publication 837. It's on revision 2 currently, and that's the RMF for federal systems. So as is typical with most things, the DoD adds layers of specificity to the federal requirements. So the DoD RMF is DoD Instruction 8510.01, which is titled Risk Management Framework for DoD Information Technology, the RMF for DoD IT. So this is where part of the problem comes from with regard to control systems. The fact that the title is called RMF for DoD IT, and of course, control systems fall into something called OT, operational technology. So a lot of people say, oh, RMF must not apply to control systems because it's titled DoD RMF for IT. So we'll talk about that in the next slide. Or actually in this slide. So on this slide, you see what the federal process says, what security authorization is. So that's the management decision to allow the system to operate. It's signed by a very senior individual who accepts the risk of operation. And on the last bullet there, you see that the DoD RMF applies to pretty much anything that receives, processes, stores, or displays, or transmits DoD information. So the key there is in that next sentence. Technology is broadly grouped as DoD information systems, platform IT, IT services, and IT products. So control systems fall in that group called platform IT or PIT. So it isn't terribly clear, but it's sufficiently clear that there's a layer of confusion there, but it is clear that the RMF does apply to control systems. So this is the RMF 6-step process. So a lot of times the general contractor or the system integrator is only required to take the process to step 5, which is the authorized process. But the first processes, it starts at the top and with categorize and moves around clockwise. So the categorize and the select is where you're determining what security controls apply to the system. That's a term that really just means security requirements. So what the security requirements are. Step 3 is, and also the continuous monitoring, and we'll talk about that. That's step 6, but we develop the strategy early on in the process. And then once those security requirements are developed, step 3 is implement. So that's where the controls are implemented. And by the way, on the bottom, you see it says the image from NIST SP 837. And again, that's the federal RMF, but the pretty much the same exact diagram is in the DoD RMF. So again, back to that implement step, when you're designing the system, developing the system and security architectures and hardening the system and implementing those security controls into the system. The bottom step there, assess. Step 4 is where that third-party assessor comes in and ensures that the system is in good shape and reports on the results of that assessment. And the authorize, again, that's where that government high-level individual says, okay, you are or you aren't ready to operate. And if they allow that operation, they're the ones signing their name and accepting that risk for operation of that system. And then step 6 is monitoring. So one thing that's new about RMF, or certainly has a lot more emphasis on RMF compared to the prior processes. You might have heard of DIACAP. Before that, we had DITSCAP. But the RMF being the most recent process for security authorization or security certification and accreditation, as we used to call it, is more focused on monitoring. So that's step 6. Sometimes federal and DoD contracts include that monitoring, and if it's an ESPC contract, that might be monitoring for 25 years. But sometimes, a lot of times, the contracts stop at that step 5, which is the authorization. All right, so we talked about the authorization quite a bit. The person who is the individual, the person that signs their name on the line there, if the system is authorized to operate, is called the authorizing official, or AO. So that's typically a general or a civilian equivalent, meaning an SES, who decides if the system's sufficiently secure to operate. The third-party assessor we talked about, again, that's the security control assessor validator. So that's the one that's actually doing the test based on those requirements that were identified as being applicable. The system owner is the individual with the overall responsibility for system implementation and security. So again, all these folks, critical roles in the RMF process, they're all government people. And we've seen a lot of problems in getting the RMF process to progress if these people aren't identified. We have a number of cases where the process has stalled because nobody wants to be system owner on the government side or whatever. It would behoove you that are general contractors, system integrators, and others in similar roles to have that dialogue if you're in a position to have that dialogue with the government, to have that dialogue and make sure they're ready to go on their side with these positions. And lastly, we've got the information system security officer. That's the person responsible for system security overall. So the UFC and the UFGS, Unified Facilities Criteria and Unified Facilities Guide Specifications, lots of confusion. We're seeing lots of confusion with regard to these documents. They are also government requirements, DoD requirements, tri-service requirements, Army, Navy, Air Force. So they are provide some actually ease into the RMF process. It reduces the rigor of some of the security requirements for facilities, facility-related control systems specifically. And in many cases, we're seeing in the government request for proposal that the general contractor can stop after only implementing basically part of the process following the UFC and the UFGS. Unfortunately, we see some confusion where the government's cut and pasted requirements that include a little bit of everything, at which point, it's important to ask questions what the government means by their request for a proposal, because there can be very significant cost differences and also potentially schedule differences in implementing kind of the partial process specified by the UFC and the UFGS versus the whole RMF process, because as you see in the middle bullet under the UFGS section on this slide, sometimes the government takes responsibility for things that might otherwise be general contractor responsibilities under the RMF assess and authorize process. All right, so we've taken a couple real requests for government requests for proposals here on this slide and the next. In both cases, they come from the Corps of Engineers, who puts out a lot of these requirements. Corps of Engineers is on the Army side is frequently the contracting activity, the government requiring organization. So in that box there, you'll see a quote directly from that RFP. So some things should stick out to you. Talks about applicable artifacts. So that's typically a requirement for the contractor to develop those artifacts for the government. It says that an ATO is required. That's the security authorization. Shall not favor functionality over security. So they're saying that security is important and not always possible to meet security requirements and still have the system function. So there's kind of an art there. And by the way, it's called RMF, Risk Management Framework. So it isn't risk avoidance framework. So it's not necessarily expected that all requirements will be met, and there's some ability to deal with that in the RMF process. The other thing that you say in there is that you see in there is it says RMF activities 1 through 5 shall be approximately 12 months. That's extremely aggressive. We typically see 18 months as a more normal time frame, and part of that is that there's a lot of government activities in the RMF process that need to be completed. So the contractor doesn't have control of the entire process. The government has things they need to do as part of those roles that we talked about in the prior slides. So you know, it's really important to recognize that, because you know, your program could be impacted by the government taking time to perform their activities that doesn't allow you to meet a schedule as aggressive as 12 months. On this slide, we've got another excerpt. There's a couple interesting things on this one. It talks about authority to connect. That means that your system is going to need to connect to an external government network. That's can be challenging because different folks typically own the network that it's connecting to compared to the control system. So it's a matter of needing to get folks together, talking, and that's really important to try to facilitate those discussions if you're able. That's one thing that we put a lot of emphasis on when we're the cyber sub, making sure to bring those folks together and help facilitate that conversation. The organizations tend to speak different languages, so we you know, we help translate and get folks talking and understanding each other and the risk posed to each system and all those sorts of things. Sometimes we're dealing with what they call closed restricted networks or standalone information systems, and if that's the case, then an ATC is not needed. Some people think that RMF doesn't apply to standalone systems. That's completely not true. You can see on our prior slide, you know, the things that RMF applies to, and it doesn't say anything about whether it's connected or not connected relative to RMF not applying, and DoD has special processes that apply. And in some cases make the RMF process easier for standalone or closed restricted networks, but it certainly still does apply. And again, government activities needed to create that authority to connect, to allow for that connection, so that schedule needs to be planned for, and again, that facilitation is really important to keep the schedule moving. All right, so typically it's a cyber sub that's handling the cyber requirements like us, like Aleta, but regardless, these are the functions that need to be performed. Early on in the process is designing the security architecture, you know, how things interrelate from a connectivity standpoint with regard to cyber security. The security engineering, hardware and software, the hardening, running the security scans and other things. And then there's the documentation piece, Lots of what Doc calls paper fertilizer is generated in that process. Lots of things that discuss how the system is going to be kept secure. So important stuff, but lots of paperwork to describe all these things that are part of the RMF process. Next to the blue callouts there, communication with all the cybersecurity system stakeholders. We talked about the government roles and the various government organizations that need to be involved and all the coordination that needs to be done. And then the EMAS tasks. So EMAS is the online documentation system that's used to both document the security posture of the system as well as to document the process as it moves along. So it's kind of a process management and documentation system within the Department of Defense. So here we're talking specifically about DoD systems. So we talked about schedule and cost impacts. I was going to talk about that, I mentioned. So I've got in the title there, not including continuous monitoring. And again, that's because the contracts typically don't include continuous monitoring, and the contractor's responsibilities usually conclude at step 5, which is authorization. So so we've got a pie chart here that talks about, you know, what the cost and schedule is for the various steps. So you can see the most time-consuming step is step 4, which is the implementation. The assessment, though, can be a bit of a schedule issue because that third-party assessor has to come in, and the government has to make sure that they get that scheduled, and that's a government reimbursable function, which means the organization, at least within the DoD, different parts of the federal government operate differently, but within the DoD, they pay for that function, they get it scheduled. So we've got multiple government organizations involved and money changing hands and things like that. So so the government pays for that, the contractor doesn't pay for that. So we only have 10% cost there because the contractor typically supports the assessment. Not a lot of work to do there, but the government is paying somebody to do some work there in addition to the contractor. So in that orange call out on the left there, again, I'm drawing attention to the fact that the typical project takes 18 months, and you know, it's possible for it to stall, and certainly we've seen it take longer because the government isn't able to identify a system owner or, you know, something else like that. So it could certainly take a lot more than 18 months, and, you know, the contractor can do a lot to keep the process moving, but the contractor can't do everything because there are government roles, government functions that need to be performed. So again, I would budget for about 18 months, assuming the process runs pretty smoothly, and assuming that the contractor does a good job in helping to facilitate that process. So that's it in a nutshell. As I mentioned, the requirements have existed for quite some time, but they're being enforced to growing extent. We're hearing some people say, oh, they just saw their first DoD cybersecurity requirement or federal cybersecurity requirement. Others have been seeing them in control systems for, I don't know, at least 7 or 8 years, maybe longer. But they're coming out more and more. The steps need to be taken early and proactively in order to ensure success, in order to ensure the project schedule moves along, because without security authorization, the system isn't supposed to be allowed to operate, and the government will typically put a halt on the process without that security authorization. So that includes the slide portion of the program. Turn it over to Dave.
Thanks, Jay. And first I want to say thanks to Jay, your team, Doc, and Todd, and all the guys at Aleta for your guidance and partnership all along this journey. We really couldn't have done this without you, and thanks for stepping on this and helping with this information that's key to all of our users and our SIs out there as well. Hey everybody, my name is Dave Winiarski. I'm the Enterprise Business Development Executive for Tridium. I focus primarily on government and DoD customers. Spent a lot of my time military, so I have a pretty good feel for what they want and what they need in many cases. I think one of the first things that's key to note is RMF, it's not new to Tridium and Niagara. And Niagara, for the most part, is not really new to most government sites. Not all may have heard of it, but most have heard of Niagara or Tridium through documentation or through Corps of Engineers or through their various agencies. So with that being said, we have an extensive knowledge and experience with DoD and government entities. None of what we typically hear is new to us. So when we get a project or we hear someone say they need something based on RMF or something that's going to be a new requirement, we've typically heard from it from one of our partners like Aleta, and we're usually on top of it pretty quickly so we can execute and work well within that realm. We have dozens of current projects, and we've executed hundreds of military sites and thousands of government buildings worldwide. Those range from DoD, GSA, some three-letter agencies, and globally we worked on some embassies as well. So a couple of the points that I have here to talk about is one thing that we typically get asked for, or one of the elements that are involved in RMF from our side, we get asked from the client or from the government agency for something you'll hear of as artifacts, RMF artifacts. So I thought it was important to address those. And what are they? And that's a key question that a lot of people ask because they hear about them, but they don't really know what they are. So RMF artifacts, where they are for us, are two suites that we have of cyber and procedural documents for Niagara 4, the JS8000, and the Edge 10 controller. And they really help to act as a guide and recommendations to help ensure the system meets the RMF requirements as it gets employed on the site. And we typically get asked for those. A lot of times the SI will ask for it because they hear about it, but a lot of times, but it has to be, as far as access goes, it has to go and is limited to the DoD, government employees and contractors that have government email addresses. So those are the folks that have access to them. So the reason for that is that the reason that they only have access to that is that this was requested by Corps of Engineers to limit exposure to cyber settings and detailed information to internal entities, right? We want to keep it internal to the government to keep those settings safe and so they understand what that needs to be and not everybody else outside of the government. So one of the applications and the process we go through for providing those artifacts to the end user is they'll get requested for an application called DoD Safe. Safe is the application, and they actually they go in and put in a request in the Safe application that the end user does that has a DoD GSA, a .mil or .gov account. They'll request that we send them through this application. They'll send us an email, and at that point we can upload those documents, and they can then go and retrieve it. And then we get an email saying, hey, this folk went and retrieved this document. So that way we have we know where the chain of custody was from beginning to end. So that just helps to secure that information. So we just wanted to pass that on just so people had a little bit of an understanding of how the whole artifact thing goes and how it gets passed from one way to the other. That way, limit the confusion there. When we talk about resources, I think a lot of our resources collaborating with experts in the field, folks like Aleta, right? I mean, they're the folks that we lean on a lot to get all the latest, greatest. Doc and Todd and these guys, they really know what's going on. They've dealt with it forever, and they help us to best understand what needs to be done with RMF and all the cyber requirements for DoD. So we collaborate with those folks quite a bit to make sure that we're on top of everything. We also offer on our website, as you can see, documentation library on Niagara community, case studies, and a ton of other information that can be used for DoD stuff, but also pretty much anything Niagara you can find on that website. So that's definitely a good resource for you. So in the big picture, we designed this TridiumTalk to provide you guys an intro to RMF, some of the documents, policies, the procedures, the stuff that helps make up the framework, the RMF and the framework. We just want to give you a look into what it takes to meet the cyber requirements when installing a BMS on a government installation. And we hope that we provided that for you. At this time, we want to open us up to questions. Doc and Todd will address a couple questions that were brought in. Doc, if you could take it and address those questions, please.
Yeah, there's one that was asked by Asim Bag. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, but I think it's a very good, insightful question. Is how does the building controls manufacturer get involved in the process if a site owner has to initiate the process as opposed to a manufacturer simply meeting a standard then it seems like site owners will go back to products that they are used to using instead of restarting the process. And I think that's a very insightful question. First of all, you need to understand that risk management framework is a system certification. It is not a product certification. So you can't get a JACE, for instance, RMF certified and then reuse that. And I know that Jay has been working on some DoD efforts to try to facilitate reuse at the component and subsystem level. Jay, you want to address any of that?
Oh, yes, it's called the Control Systems Tested Products List, and it's a program that was funded by the DoD Reform Committee under the Deputy Secretary of Defense to do exactly that, provide for reuse. It's a process that's had input from over 103 different stakeholders across the federal government, but it's just really just in its infancy. So look for that, more information on that in the future.
Okay, so there's another question in there about somebody has asked about how much does this support cost, and I answered that approximately $200K. That very much depends on the complexity of the system. It very much depends on where the system is located. For example, a system that is logically isolated, that has no external connections, the requirements for RMF are much lower. But as soon as you have external connectivity, for example, you want to get to the Niagara server using a web browser from anywhere on post, or heaven forbid anywhere outside post, those requirements for RMF compliance go up dramatically. It also depends on whether, you know, travel costs are involved, so on and so forth. We have some projects in Korea, for example, that are largely driven by the cost of the travel. Remote access is a huge issue, and the DoD generally will not allow any kind of remote access unless that access is from a DoD provided and configured and managed node. So sometimes there needs to be GFE provided to the entities that are going to need to have that remote access.
Yeah, if I could jump in there for just a second, I would say range of cost is anywhere from 35 to 500K plus. Again, depending on the complexity, the amount of travel, and particularly the connectivity requirements for the system.
So back to Dave, I think.
Yes, sir. Yeah, thanks, Doc. We appreciate you and Jay for answering those. Thanks for jumping in and taking care of that. So everyone, we want to thank everyone for joining, and let you note, as Scott mentioned at the beginning, a recording of this Tridium Talk, it's going to be posted on the events page of the Tridium website, which you saw the link at the beginning, and that'll be done in the next couple of days. And any questions that were submitted and we didn't get to because of the time frame we had here, we'll get those answered offline, and we'll get all those sent out. And if you have any other questions, you know, feel free to email myself or Danielle, and you also have Jay and his team's information sitting there in front of you as well. So if you have any questions that are outstanding, please feel free to reach out to us, and we appreciate your time, and thanks for coming and joining this Tridium Talk today. Have a good day.